Slavery in America, one of the most heinous systems in human history, has also been one of the most commonly evaded discussion points in American conversation. Americans must face slavery in the way that it affected the lives of the American people and the foundation of our nation. Undeniably important to this discussion is its lasting effects upon the lives of the enslaved and their descendants. But, as Toni Morrison said in her essay, Playing in the Dark, equally valuable to the examination of the mind, imagination, and behavior of slaves is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of masters. Several notions within this quotation will be important to my argument today. First, that racial ideology has played a part in the dividing of slaveholders and their descendants. As Toni Morrison later touches on in her essay, the lack of realization of the importance of slavery within the identities of white people has caused a lack of conceptualization of the system within our country. I will take this a step further by showing that holders define themselves not only within a racial ideology, but they also use the specific enslaved people they held as a definition of their masculinity and femininity. Also important within this quotation is the separation of the mind, imagination, and behavior of the slaveholder. These categories can also be referred to as personal identity, justification of the system, and presented identity. Through my research, I have discovered that Morrison's statements can be proven with tangible evidence. Not only that these effects occurred, but also that they must be understood by all those affected. For both white men and women in the South during the Antebellum period, the act of owning slaves was extremely important to the definition of success. Look at these two quotes. Here, J.E. Smith, a member of the majority of free Southerners who did not hold people, remarks upon his wishes to become a part of the slave-owning class. He and other non-slaveholders saw slaveholding as an ideal and a representation of success. Smith reveals that even if he cannot get into the planter class, the elite group of plantation owners who owned more than 20 slaves, the procurement of a few slaves will better his situation. Northerners also took note of this strange manifestation of the American dream. Here, Edward Russell, a Northerner visiting the South, criticizes the Southern population for their fixation with slavery. This quote reveals especially the circular and repetitive nature of the system. Because owning slaves is the ideal, everything else within the system goes towards getting slaves. In his book, Soul by Soul, Walter Johnson describes this system of social mobilization as the passage from non-slaveholder to slaveholder, and the planters as a master class within the South, echoing similar ideas of mobilization within other periods of American history, including our own. For slaveholders, the maintenance of the system, of which they were at the top, led them to focus more on their appearance and reputation more than their actual satisfaction of life. Because slaveholders were the ideal of the Southern antebellum period, the men and women of that class came to represent the ideals of masculinity and femininity in the South. For men, this involved projected agency and power over their family and property, including enslaved people. For women, it involved a projected perfection within the ideal of domesticity. Masculinity in the South during the antebellum period had to do completely with power, especially over the people they enslaved. This manifested in an importance of honor and protection, brutalism, paternalism, and brutality and emasculation. While the concept of honor and dueling had begun to die down within the North by the beginning of the 19th century, the South saw continuing numbers of duels. These duels often arose when the reputation of the man was questioned or threatened, and these reputations involved their control of their dependents being their family and their slaves. Take, for instance, this quote from Thomas Roderick Dew's dissertation on the characteristic differences between the sexes, which notes the need for men to avenge any insult that might be put on a woman of their domain. Other than dueling, men turned to protection of their dependents to represent their honor and masculinity. To protect his family, a Southern man had to provide to their needs. As only men were welcome as buyers at slave markets, buying slaves for family members, such as a maid for the wife, was included within providing for the family. White men at slave markets were often noted to force into the conversation that they were providing through their family. As you can see in this picture, most, or not, if not all, of the white people at slave markets were men. Protection of enslaved people by slaveholding men was broken into two sections: the view of slaves as economic property and the view of slaves as human. When slaves were viewed as property, the expectation upon their holders became the protection of assets. Just as a stockholder today is expected to have a savviness, and when to buy and sell, slaveholders were expected to be knowledgeable upon the people they enslaved. This becomes especially clear within the planter class, as the high amount of enslaved people allowed holders to view them as numbers, similar to their amount of crops. The more emotional side of the protection of slaves by slaveholding men involved paternalism. Paternalism was the justification of slavery that stated that the system helped the enslaved to become better people. Paternalism turned the plantation system into a family. The slaveholder became the father, and the entire plantation became his children, or dependents. Thus, paternalism, from the Latin root pater, for father. There were many arguments slaveholders used for the salvation of slavery. Many pointed to the ways that buying slaves could reunite families. Many slaveholding men saw the act of going to the slave market as a way for them to rescue enslaved people from the slave market, albeit by putting them into slavery. There was also the argument that the high price of slaves as compared to other commodities showed the respect that slaveholders had for them. Lastly, and most importantly, Southern men argued that black people were an inferior race and therefore were in slavery for their own good and the good of their country. Let's look at this quotation from George Fitzhugh's 1854 book, Sociology for the South, or The Failure of Free Society. Fitzhugh describes black people as a grown-up child. And it claims that they were allowed to hold, if they were allowed to hold the normal rights of people in democracy, they would be an insufferable burden to society. He also claims that black people are better off with slavery, and as they are an inferior race. This last claim, as well as the description as children, serves to show how white Southern men saw themselves as protecting enslaved people. This protection helped Southern men to identify as honorable. But they also turned to emasculation of and brutality towards their slaves to protect their power. Enslaved men, seen as children, were expected to be less masculine than their holders. Holders often actively emasculated the men they held to uphold their superior masculinity. One example of this is the clothes young enslaved men were often forced to wear. Boys were given dress-like shirts and no pants, often the same uniform as girls. This helped to feminize the boys. Diaries and accounts of freed people after emancipation showed that enslaved males would sometimes wear these shirts well into their 20s. Another example of emasculation is the constant referral to black men as bucks and overly sexual beings. Because men were expected to be noble and respectful, this hypersexualization transferred to their lack of masculinity or humanity. In terms of brutality, slaveholding men used violence against enslaved people, especially men, to present their power. While violence was certainly used to affect the slaves themselves, it was also used as a presentation for other white men. Examine this photograph. We see black men in the background, but also a white man watching the presentation of violence. As Solomon Northup noted in 12 Years a Slave, white men took pride in subduing the spirit of a slave and matching their will against that of a slave. And those who succeeded in doing these things were recognized by the community as a powerful man. The word match especially reveals the necessity to compare the masculinities of master and slave. As an extension of this expectation, disobedient slaves were seen as a failure of the masculinity of the holder. There are even examples of holders beating their slaves to the point of inability to work or walk. When brutality reached this point, the enslaved person became nothing but a symbol to the surrounding white people of the holder's power. When examining femininity during the antebellum period in the South, it is important to understand the cult of domesticity. This was the ideal that women represented the home and all things emotional within the family. Within domesticity, which was upheld all over the United States, a woman's most important job was to provide affection and care for her family. Therefore, slaveholding women of the South were seen to embody the ultimate housewife, or true woman, because they did need to perform did not need to perform the manual labor of housework and were instead able to focus on their husbands and children. Though lack of labor was not necessarily important within the cult of domesticity, as there were other ways for a woman to prioritize her family, for example in the North, it became extremely important in the ideal woman of the South. Within these expectations came the rise of the popularity of white, untanned skin, as this showed avoidance of the sun and outside work, and the ability to enjoy leisure activities, and the use of constricting clothing to show the lack of required work. Looking back at Thomas Dew's quotation, as well as this poem by privileged Southerner Louisa Cheeves McCord, shows clear examples of the expectations of women by Southerners. Here, Dew mentions the beauty and meekness of women, while McCord shows the role of women to comfort, minister, and help men, as well as being the world's soothing mother. We can also look to Gone with the Wind for expectations of Southern women. In one scene, Scarlett O'Hara, who in reality has lost much of her estate and has had to perform manual labor, wears a dress made of curtains to perform her elegance. However, Rhett Butler rejects her because of the roughness of her hands, as this shows that she has been performing manual labor and is therefore not following the expectations of Southern femininity. As shown by Scarlett O'Hara's dress, slaveholding women put more importance on their appearance as leisurely and delicate than their actual experiences, similar to the presentations of slaveholding men. However, as shown by Erin Mulligan in her essay Paternalism and the Southern Hierarchy, many Southern women, white women, were highly involved in the everyday management of a plantation, as well as helping with domestic chores, often to keep the plantation afloat. The system of paternalism also had a large effect in slaveholding women's lives. While these women used paternalism to justify slavery, they also used it to garner some agency within their households. Because enslaved people were seen as the holder's children, the mistress of the plantation became their mother and held certain levels of power over them. For Southern women in support of slavery, paternalism also became a successful justification for them to use for slavery because they still remained within their gender boundaries having to do with family. Women could also use the justification of slavery that it allowed them to truly fulfill the ideals of the cult of domesticity. Finally, slaveholding women defined themselves against enslaved women. Enslaved women performed labor and lacked cohesive families. This lack of proper motherhood was highlighted because their children were seen as property rather than guarded beings by the parents. These distinctions heightened slaveholding women's motherhood. Clearly, the ideals for both men and women within the South during the antebellum period were defined by and against enslaved people. Looking back at our first quote from Toni Morrison, we come back to how these expectations had to do with the mind, imagination, and behavior of the masters, or rather, their personal identity, justification of their system, and presented identity. Slaveholding men presented themselves as honorable and powerful, proved by the way they treated their slaves. They justified and imagined themselves as fathers of the slaves. Personally, they saw slavery as a definition of their success. Slaveholding women then presented themselves as delicate and leisurely, as their required labor was performed by enslaved people. They justified their identities with the success of the cult of domesticity. And hid their personal experiences of labor. While this investigation has only scratched the surface of the complex and often hidden identities of slaveholders, I hope that I have begun to lead you towards the fuller examination of the effects of racial ideologies in America.